Angela Chuse had learned early in life that the truly dangerous men didn't scream. They lived in absolute, suffocating silence. The Hoon estate was a monument to that silence. As she walked through the obsidian-tiled entrance hall, she counted no fewer than 12 security detail. Men in razor-sharp suits whose eyes didn't just track her movement, they seemed to weigh her very soul. Miss Chuse. The voice belonged to a man as cold and functional as the steel elevator doors behind him. He was middle-aged, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. "I am Director Kong. Mr. Bay does not like to be kept waiting." She followed Kong through corridors where the air felt pressurized. The walls were adorned with minimalist art and high-definition monitors that flickered with a constant, rhythmic pulse of surveillance feeds. The agency had hammered the rules into her for 3 days straight. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look Mr. Bay in the eye. Above all, do not disturb the dog. When the double doors to the private study groaned open, the scent of expensive sandalwood and aged whiskey hit her first. Bay Hoon stood with his back to her, silhouetted against a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Seoul skyline. Even from behind, his presence was overwhelming. The immaculate cut of his black suit draped over shoulders that looked capable of carrying the weight of an entire criminal empire. On a velvet rug near his feet lay Benny, a small, white, trembling Maltese who looked entirely too fragile for such a fortress. The dog let out a sharp, petty yap, baring tiny teeth at Angela. Hoon didn't turn. He simply swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking like a death knell in the quiet room. "The last 3 maids lasted less than 48 hours, he said. His voice a low, melodic velvet that made the hair on Angela's neck stand up. "Benny does not like strangers. And I do not like people who fail my dog." He turned then, his angular jaw catching the dim light, his gaze piercing directly into hers. "You have one job, Angela. Make him happy, or you will find that my generosity has very strict limits." The heavy oak doors of the study closed with a finality that felt like a gavel striking a bench. Left alone in the sprawling silence of the foyer, Angela took a steadying breath, the scent of Director Kang's cold cologne still lingering in the air. She was now a ghost in a house of stone, tasked with the care of a creature that seemed to hate the very air she breathed. She began her chores in the east wing, her movements precise and hushed. As she polished the cold marble surfaces and dusted the minimalist artifacts, she couldn't shake the sensation of a prickle at the base of her neck. It wasn't just the guards outside. It was the house itself. In every corner, tucked discreetly behind a crown molding or embedded within the eye of a decorative sculpture, a small, unblinking red light stared back at her. The eyes were everywhere. Bay Hoon was watching, not for her to succeed but for her to break. She found Benny in the sunroom, a glass-walled sanctuary that felt more like an observation deck. The small Maltese was perched on a silk cushion that likely cost more than Angela's yearly rent. As she approached with a fresh bowl of filtered water, the dog's transformation was instantaneous. The petty behavior Director Kong had warned her about was an understatement. Benny's tiny frame shook with a feral intensity. He bared his teeth, letting out a series of sharp high-pitched yaps that echoed off the glass walls. When she reached out to set the bowl down, Benny lunged. His teeth snapped inches from her fingers, a blur of white fur and redirected rage. Angela didn't pull back with a scream. She froze, her hand hovering just out of reach, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked into the dog's watery eyes and saw something other than aggression. It was the frantic, jagged look of a creature that had been given everything money could buy but lacked the one thing it actually needed. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely a ripple in the quiet room. "It's a big house to be so small in, isn't it?" From his darkened study miles of fiber-optic cable away, Bay Hoon swirled his whiskey and leaned closer to the monitor. He watched the high-definition feed of the girl standing perfectly still before the snapping animal. Most had yelled. Some had even tried to kick. But Angela Chuse simply stayed, her shadow stretching across the floor, waiting for the storm to pass. He watched her fingers relax, not in surrender, but in a strange, quiet invitation. He narrowed his eyes, the amber light of the screen reflecting in his pupils. He was waiting for the mask to slip, for the frustration to take over. But as the minutes ticked by, the only thing that moved in the room was the steady, patient rhythm of her breathing. Bae-hoon sat in the absolute darkness of his private sanctuary, the only light emanating from the wall of high-definition monitors that flickered like cold, blue ghosts. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking with a rhythmic, lonely sound. On the screens, the house was a grid of silent, opulent cages, but his focus remained fixed on the sunroom. He had seen this play out a dozen times before. The initial patience of a new hire always gave way to the same inevitable conclusion. Frustration, a raised voice, or a hidden shove when they thought the master was out of reach. He leaned forward, his sharp features caught in the glow of the display. He watched Angela Chu stand before Benny, the small dog a whirlwind of white fur and bared teeth. He expected her to recoil or to mutter a curse under her breath. He waited for the mask of the professional maid to slip and reveal the same jagged impatience he felt from everyone else in his life. But as the seconds bled into minutes, Angela remained a statue of calm. Even when Benny lunged, snapping his jaws mere inches from her skin, her expression didn't harden into anger. Instead, it softened into something he hadn't seen in that room for years. Genuine, unhurried pity. Hoon took a slow draw of his whiskey, the burn in his throat matching the strange tightening in his chest. Through the high-sensitivity microphones, her whisper reached him, a low, melodic murmur that seemed to bypass the digital speakers and vibrate in the room with him. "It's a big house to be so small in, isn't it?" The words hung in the air, a mirror reflecting his own isolated existence. He watched as she slowly lowered herself to the floor, sitting on the cold marble without regard for her pristine uniform. She didn't try to force her affection on the animal. She simply occupied the space, offering her presence as a silent truce. Hoon found himself holding his breath, his hand tightening around the crystal glass. He was a man who traded in secrets and leveraged fear, yet he was mesmerized by this quiet display of vulnerability. He told himself he was looking for a reason to fire her, a reason to prove that his cynicism was justified. But as he watched her sit in the silence with the dog that everyone else called a monster, he realized with a jolt of unease that he wasn't looking for a mistake anymore. He was looking for hope. By the third day, the heavy silence of the estate had begun to reveal its secrets to Angela. As she moved through the sun-drenched corridors with a microfiber cloth and a bucket of specialized polish, she realized that the petty aggression Benny displayed wasn't born of malice, but of a profound, echoing isolation. The dog followed her at a distance, a white shadow with a low growl perpetually caught in his throat, watching her as intensely as the cameras did. She entered the grand conservatory, where the dust motes danced in the afternoon light. Benny hopped onto a velvet ottoman, his tiny body tense, his eyes tracking the rhythmic movement of her hands. Angela didn't look at him directly. She knew by now that direct eye contact felt like a challenge to him. Instead, she began to hum. It was a faint, breathy sound at first, a melody pulled from the deepest corners of her own childhood. As she reached for a high shelf, the humming transformed into the soft lyrics of an old Korean lullaby. Her voice was thin but steady, carrying a warmth that the marble walls seemed to absorb hungrily. "Sleep, sleep, my baby. The forest is quiet, the moon is your mother." The effect was instantaneous. Benny's ears, usually pinned back in a defensive line, flicked forward. The low rumble in his chest died away, replaced by a confused, tilted-head curiosity. For the first time, the tiny dog didn't look like a weapon. He looked like a child trying to remember a dream. In the surveillance suite, the crystal glass in Bae-hoon's hand paused halfway to his lips. He sat perfectly still, his frame cast in the flickering blue light of the monitors. The high-sensitivity audio captured every inflection of Angela's voice, the vowels soft and rounded, filling his cold office with a ghost of a memory he had tried for years to bury. Hoon froze. He knew that song. It was the same melody his own mother had sung in the small, cramped apartment of his youth, long before the suits, the blood, and the obsidian towers. He watched the screen with a piercing, unblinking intensity. On the monitor, Angela continued to polish the silver, her back turned to the dog, her voice rising and falling in a gentle arc of sound. Benny did something Hoon hadn't seen him do in 3 years. The dog let out a long, heavy sigh and lowered his chin onto his paws, his eyes slowly fluttering shut. He wasn't guarding the room anymore. He was resting. Hoon's grip tightened on his glass until his knuckles turned white. He had hired a maid to clean his house and a servant to manage his dog, but as he watched Angela choose through the digital veil, he realized she was doing something far more dangerous. She was bringing the dead parts of his home back to life. The following night, the fragile peace of the estate shattered. It happened in the small hours, when the moon was a sharp silver sliver hanging over the Seoul skyline. Angela was jolted from a light sleep by a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, rhythmic choking noise coming from the corner of the staff quarters where Benny's luxury bed had been moved. She rushed to him, finding the small dog convulsing, his white fur matted with sweat and vomit. Near his bed lay the remains of a decorative lily he must have nipped at in the garden earlier that evening, a plant as beautiful as it was toxic. Benny's eyes were rolled back, his tiny paws scratching fruitlessly at the air as his breath came in ragged, wet gasps. Panic flared in Angela's chest, but she forced it down. She knew the rules. She was supposed to call Director Kong for any emergency. But as she looked at the ticking clock and the seizing animal, she knew Benny didn't have the minutes it would take for a formal security response. She scooped the trembling dog into her arms, ignoring the mess on her uniform, and rushed to the kitchen. With trembling hands, she mixed a slurry of charcoal and water she found in the emergency kit, coaxing it down his throat with a syringe while whispering frantic, soft reassurances. For the next 6 hours, the kitchen became a silent battlefield. Angela didn't leave his side for a second. She sat on the cold linoleum floor, cradling Benny's head in her lap. Every time his body racked with another bout of sickness, she cleaned him with warm towels, murmuring the same lullaby from the day before. Her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, and her hair had fallen out of its neat bun, but her grip on the dog remained a steady, anchor-like presence. High above in the surveillance suite, Bae-hoon hadn't moved. His whiskey was long forgotten, sitting untouched on the mahogany desk. He watched the monitor with a terrifying, singular focus. He saw Angela forego her own comfort, saw her ruin her clothes and spend hours on her knees in the dark, tending to a creature that had tried to bite her only days ago. He watched her pull a blanket around herself and the dog as the fever finally began to break in the pre-dawn light. She was rocking him, her head leaning against the base of a kitchen cabinet, her eyes finally fluttering shut as Benny tucked his nose into the crook of her elbow. Hoon reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the glass screen, tracing the curve of Angela's tired face. For a man who viewed loyalty as something to be bought or coerced, this selfless display was a revelation. She didn't know he was watching. She had no reason to perform. Yet, she was protecting his heart as if it were her own. In that moment, the watcher felt a strange, painful crack in his own armor. The girl wasn't just a maid. She was a miracle he hadn't known he was looking for. The morning sun filtered through the study's heavy velvet curtains, casting long, golden ribs across the floor as Angela worked. Benny, still recovering from the night's ordeal, followed her with a newfound, quiet devotion, his tiny paws clicking softly on the hardwood. While dusting the lower shelves of a recessed mahogany bookcase, Angela's cloth snagged on a small, silver frame tucked behind a row of leather-bound law texts. She pulled it out, intending to clean it, but the image staring back at her made her breath hitch. It was a candid photograph, aged and slightly yellowed at the edges. In it, a much younger Bae-hoon stood in a garden that looked nothing like this fortress. He looked soft, his eyes bright with a genuine smile that seemed impossible now. Beside him was a woman with the same sharp, elegant features, her hands cradling a much younger, more vibrant Benny. The woman's warmth radiated through the glass, a stark contrast to the cold museum Angela now inhabited. On the back of the frame, a delicate hand had written in elegant script, "For my son Hoon. May you always have a piece of my heart to guard when I am gone." In the surveillance room, Bae-hoon's jaw tightened as he watched Angela discover the relic. He remembered the day that photo was taken, the last summer before the illness took his mother, leaving him with nothing but a crumbling reputation to rebuild and a small, grieving dog that refused to eat for weeks. Benny wasn't just a pet. He was the final, living link to the only person who had ever loved Hoon without conditions. When his mother died, Hoon had built these walls, installed these cameras, and hired these guards to protect the only thing he had left of her. He had become a monster to the world so that no one could ever get close enough to hurt the small piece of her heart that remained. He watched through the screen as Angela didn't just replace the photo. She took a corner of her apron and polished the silver frame until it shone, her touch lingering on the glass over his mother's face with a reverence that felt like a prayer. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't look for approval. She simply placed the photo back in its hidden spot. But this time, she angled it so that if Hoon were to sit at his desk, the first thing he would see was his mother's smile. Hoon leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. For years, he had guarded that memory with iron and fire, believing that isolation was the only way to keep it safe. But as he watched Angela return to her work, humming that same lullaby, he realized that he hadn't been guarding a memory. He had been burying it. And this stranger, with her tired eyes and stained uniform, was the first person to treat his grief not as a weakness to be exploited, but as a sanctuary to be honored. The afternoon brought a restless, inconsolable energy to the estate. Benny had been pacing the corridors for hours, letting out a low, mournful whimper that pierced the heavy silence of the halls. Angela had tried everything: fresh water, organic treats, and the soft humming of the lullaby. But the small dog remained agitated, his nose pressed against the locked mahogany doors of the master's private study. He pawed at the wood, his cries turning into sharp yelps of genuine distress. Angela knew the rules. Director Kong had been explicit. The study was a sanctuary of secrets, a forbidden zone where the maid's presence was an unforgivable intrusion. To enter without an express invitation was to forfeit her position, and likely her safety. But as she watched Benny's tiny frame tremble with a grief she now understood, she realized he wasn't being petty. He was looking for his blue star, the worn plush toy she had seen in the background of the old photograph with Hoon's mother. It was the only thing Benny had left that smelled of the woman who was gone. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Angela glanced at the unblinking red eye of the camera mounted above the door. She knew Bae-hoon was likely miles away in a boardroom, or perhaps closer than she dared to imagine, watching her every move. She reached for the brass handle. It was unlocked, a rare oversight or perhaps a test. With a soft click, she stepped into the sanctum of the watcher. The room was bathed in shadows and the scent of expensive tobacco. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a drum as she moved toward the heavy desk. Benny darted ahead, scurrying toward a low cabinet in the corner. He began to scratch at a small gap beneath the hand-carved wood. Angela knelt, her fingers brushing against the cold, dark floor as she reached into the darkness. Her hand closed around something soft and velvet. As she pulled it out, she heard the faint, telltale hum of a motorized camera lens adjusting its focus. She froze. In the corner of the room, the security eye whirled, its red light intensifying as it tracked her movement. She held the blue star toy to her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was caught. She had violated the sanctuary of a man who didn't believe in second chances. Yet, as Benny let out a soft, relieved sigh and nudged his head against her hand, Angela didn't run. She stood up slowly, adjusted the silver frame she had polished earlier so it sat perfectly straight, and placed the toy gently in Benny's mouth. She looked directly into the camera lens, not with defiance, but with a quiet, steady resolve that said she would do it again. She turned and walked out, leaving the silence of the room heavier than she had found it, unaware that in a high-rise across the city, Bae-hoon had stopped his meeting entirely. His eyes fixed on a tablet screen, watching the girl who chose a dog's happiness over her own survival. The violent shattering of the front entrance echoed through the mansion like a thunderclap, instantly dissolving the stagnant silence of the late afternoon. It wasn't the rhythmic chime of a visitor, but the jagged rhythmic staccato of gunfire and the heavy thud of tactical boots on marble. The iron fortress had been breached. From the kitchen, Angela heard the panicked shouts of the security detail. Men who had been paid for their presence, but not for their lives. Within minutes, the sounds of scuffling heels and retreating tires suggested that the unsmilable guards had chosen survival over the estate. Angela's first instinct was the front door, a clear path to the service entrance that led to the street. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and the distant chilling sound of men searching the upper floors for the boss. But as she reached the threshold of the kitchen, a small, desperate whimper caught her ear. She turned to see Benny huddled under the prep table, his tiny body vibrating with a terror so profound he couldn't even bark. He looked at her with wide, watery eyes, his petty defenses completely stripped away. To leave him was to ensure he would be caught in the crossfire of a war he didn't understand, a final, cruel end to the only piece of Bae-hoon's mother left in the world. "Come here, Benny," Angela whispered, her voice trembling but firm. She didn't run for the exit. Instead, she knelt in the middle of the chaos and scooped the shivering dog into her arms, tucking him securely under her uniform jacket. She could hear the heavy footsteps approaching the kitchen, the metallic slide of a weapon being readied. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against Benny's side, their pulses sinking in the darkness of the pantry where she ducked. She had the chance to slip through the servants' hatch and disappear into the sole alleyways, but she stayed. She pressed her back against the cold steel of the industrial shelving, shielding the dog with her own body as the door swung open and a flashlight's beam cut through the gloom. In a hidden bunker miles away, Bae-hoon watched the feed from his handheld device, his face a mask of frozen horror. He saw the guards flee. He saw the hit squad enter. But then he saw Angela. He watched as she turned away from the open exit, watched as she chose to stay in the line of fire for a creature that wasn't even hers. He saw her face, pale, terrified but resolute, as she looked at the dog instead of the danger. For the first time in his life, the man who controlled everything was completely powerless. His eyes burning as he watched a girl with no armor become the only shield his heart had left. The silence that followed the violence was more deafening than the gunfire had been. When the heavy tires of the armored SUVs screeched onto the gravel driveway, it wasn't a rescue, it was a reclamation. Bae-hoon moved through the wreckage of his home like a vengeful specter, his black suit stained with the dust of the breach, his jaw set in a line of terrifying cold fury. His men fanned out, their weapons drawn, but Hoon's eyes were fixed on only one direction. He found them in the darkened pantry, tucked behind a fallen shelf. Angela was sitting on the floor, her uniform torn at the shoulder and a dark bruise blooming across her cheek where a splintered cabinet had struck her. But she wasn't looking at the blood or the ruins of the kitchen. She was cradling Benny against her chest, her hand covering the dog's eyes to shield him from the sight of the bodies being cleared from the hall. Hoon stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in a way that had nothing to do with the adrenaline of the fight. He saw the way Benny, the dog who had bitten every hand that fed him, was tucked into the crook of her neck, his breathing finally steady. Angela looked up, her gaze meeting Hoon's. She didn't offer an excuse for the mess or a plea for her life. She simply whispered, "He's safe." He was so scared, but he's safe. Hoon didn't offer a hand to help her up. His face remained an unreadable mask of stone, though his pulse thrummed visibly in his throat. "Director Kong will see to your injuries," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. "When you are cleaned up, come to the 3rd floor. The room at the end of the hall. The one with the reinforced door." He turned and walked away before she could answer. An hour later, Angela stood before the heavy door of the one room she had been told never to enter, the surveillance suite. When she stepped inside, the darkness was absolute, save for the wall of glowing monitors. Bae-hoon sat in his leather chair, the blue light of the screens reflecting in his dark eyes like a sea of digital ghosts. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the chair beside him. On the screens the footage was paused. It wasn't the footage of the intruders or the guards fleeing. It was a loop of her 3 days ago, singing the lullaby. It was her 2 nights ago, sleeping on the kitchen floor with a sick dog. "I have spent my life watching people reveal who they truly are when they think they are alone," Hoon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate velvet. "Most people are disappointing, Angela. But you are a problem I didn't expect." The air in the surveillance suite was thick with the hum of electronics and the heavy weight of secrets. Hoon stood up, the light from the monitors casting long, jagged shadows against his sharp features. With a flick of his wrist, he gestured toward the wall of screens. "I spent a fortune on these," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "I bought the best eyes money could find because I believed that everyone had a price, a breaking point, or a hidden malice. I watched you because I was waiting for you to fail." He stepped closer, stopping only inches from Angela. The dark elegance that usually defined him seemed to flicker, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. "I watched you sing to a dog that hated you. I watched you stay on a cold floor through the night to save a life that meant nothing to the rest of the world. And today," he paused, his gaze dropping to the bruise on her cheek, "I watched you stay in a line of fire for a piece of my past when even my own men ran for their lives." Angela looked at the screens, seeing the frozen images of her own quiet acts of kindness. "You saw everything," she whispered, the realization sinking in. "I saw a woman who doesn't just follow orders, but follows her heart," Hoon replied. He reached into the pocket of his black suit and pulled out a small velvet box. The click of it opening was the only sound in the room. Inside, a diamond sparkled with a fire that rivaled the cold glow of the monitors. Angela gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "Mr. Bay, I'm just a maid." "No," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper of fierce conviction. "You are the only person I have ever met who is stronger than the walls I built. I don't want a maid, Angela. I don't want someone who fears me or someone who merely survives my world. I want a partner. I want a woman who can hold my heart as carefully as she held that dog in the dark." He took her hand, his touch surprisingly warm against her trembling skin. "My world is dangerous, and the shadows are long. But I realize today that I cannot face them alone anymore. Stay with us, not as an employee but as my wife. Help me remember how to be the man in that photograph." In the silence of the high-tech sanctuary, the watcher finally closed the gap between the screens and reality. Angela looked into his dark eyes and saw not the Mafia Boss, but a man finally coming home. She didn't look at the cameras anymore, she looked at him. And as she slowly nodded, the monitors behind them flickered and dimmed, their long watch finally over.